It is my pleasure to welcome you to the international conference on the lesson of the pandemic, which is a closing event for 2020 for the online project, The World Post-COVID-19 Pandemic, a humanist vision for a sustainable development. Throughout this project, the Institute for Advanced Study in Levant Culture and Civilization launched in May 2020. The intention was to create a pattern of perspective on the global future in the aftermath of the pandemic. The goal of the project was to gather contribution from as many fields of activity as possible. Education, culture, scientific research, technological progress, natural resources and biodiversity, sociology, psychology, cultural diplomacy, ethics, civic responsibility and leadership. Through these contributions, the authors attempt to find answers to the questions that trouble us all. Among them, what will our respective fields of activity look like after the end of the pandemic? Will there be a new normal? And if so, can we predict how new it will really be? What should each of us to adapt to the new situation after the pandemic? The contributions received thus far have all attempt to identify the principal issues plaguing every field of activity, seeking to provide solution and recommendation for the global crisis aftermath. However, the pandemic is still ongoing, and our attempt to compile a collection of recommendations and visions of the post-COVID-19 world might, in hindsight, have been slightly rushed. Consequently, the present conference brings together several of the original contributors to the "What will the world look like after the pandemic" platform, in an attempt to revisit the lessons the pandemic taught us. It is still too early to speak of lessons learned. Instead, we should focus on the problems we identified and attempt to transform them in the most instructive of lessons. Joining me today is Dr. Wana Brenda, whom most of you know, as she has been the contact person and who is the project manager of the World Post-COVID-19, a humanist vision for a sustainable development project. Let me now introduce you now to our speakers, whom I will present and then invite to share with us their ideas on how they assumed that their activity and part of the world changed as a result of the pandemic. Afterwards, I propose we move to a Q&A session to get more in-depth knowledge on this topic. I propose a 5-minute intervention from each of you in order to have time for further discussions and conclusions. Firstly, I'm sure that most of you are familiar with Gary Jacobs, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the World Academy of Art of Science, Chairman of the Board and CEO of the World University Consortium, managing editor of Cadmus Journal, vice president of the Mother Service Society, a social science research institute in Pondicherry, South India, and distinguished professor of interdisciplinary study at the Person-Centered Approach Institute, Italy. Gary is an American-born international consultant on management and economic development, whose research interest within the Mother Service Society focused on economic, social development, employment, organizational theory, psychology, education and development strategies for the government of India. Last but not least, he is also an active member of the Club of Rome. Dear friend, you wrote to us about a planetary moment that the pandemic struck and the momentum it gathered. Please tell us more about the outcome so far of this momentum.
Thank you, Emil. Thank you for the invitation, and a great pleasure to be with so many old friends and familiar faces that I don't get to meet often enough on this at this critical time. In the 5 minutes, I'd like to briefly address a few issues. I think that we're all familiar enough with the catastrophic impact of the pandemic that, and maybe others will be talking about it. I'm not going to spend my time on that, except to say that in the Academy, we've been particularly concerned with the drastic increase in food insecurity and hunger that's about doubled in this year, an increase from about 135 million to 265 million young people around the world, according to World Food Program. And the tremendous loss of employment opportunities, estimated by ILO, is about 500 million jobs. And this is only two of the many, many critical impacts, and that tells us that this is really impacting on human security. But in answer to Emil's question, I'd like to focus on what I see are the opportunities created by this very, very severe challenge. It's forcing us, it's forcing humanity to come to grips and challenge some of the orthodoxies and entrenched policies that have prevented greater, bolder moves towards a new paradigm in human security all of these years. And in a few areas, we've seen dramatic, rapid change that certainly has not washed away our problems, but it shows us that maybe we need the intensity of challenges that are really life, not just life-threatening, but life-taking, to break the mold of our resistance to moving forward. And I'm going to cite just a couple of examples of that, of what I see as the opportunities created by the severe crisis that we're under. One is in the field of finance. We've been working for more than 10 years in the need to break the present financial regime, which has the vast bulk. There's no shortage of money in the world. We have trillions and trillions of dollars. We have about 350 trillion in financial assets, and a very small portion of that is really going towards meeting people's human needs for human development and sustainability. And this system has resisted under an economic orthodoxy that justifies the way things work. And now we're seeing a change in that. We saw it the first time in 2008 after the financial crisis, when suddenly, after the government saying we have no money to spend, suddenly US government alone came up with about $10 trillion to invest in bailing out the financial institutions, because that's where the money and that's where the power is. And then again, it repeated this year with what we call quantitative easing or other types of public expenditure that have vastly increased the amount of money available. I'm not looking at the short-term benefits of that. I'm looking at pushing this as a long-term policy change that says we have the money and we can create the money necessary to finance human needs. In fact, it's the cheapest thing we can do. If we don't do it now, if we don't invest in sustainability now, the cost of doing so later will be unimaginable. They'll be beyond any hope. If we don't invest in creating employment for people now, the social cost of it will be far higher than the cost of employing people. So within the academy, we're talking about and proposing serious job guarantee programs and showing how they can be financed through creation of new public money, and that will be much lower in cost to society than it will be to continue the way we're going now. So this is one, briefly, this is one of the areas where I think that the challenge has created an opportunity. It's for us to exploit and build on it. The second area where so much has been talked about is education. We started Winston Nagan is here, one of our, was chairman of the board at that time and a founding member of the World University Consortium founded at University of California, Berkeley in 2013, because we saw that the present mode of delivery of higher education is simply inadequate to meet the needs of humanity for two very clear reasons. One, because the cost of education is so fabulously high in countries like the US, where the average student debt is about $30,000 and the total student debt is about 1.6 trillion. And in developing countries where, according to UNESCO, we would have to open up a new university the size of Harvard every day of the week for the next 15 years, simply to absorb and provide higher educational opportunities for all the students who seek it. And in this increasingly challenging world where education is necessary to prepare youth for the future, there's simply no way to do it through this system. We don't have the teachers, we don't have the money to do it that way. So the opportunity that was created with the birth of online learning about 10 years ago and the growth of Coursera and Udacity and other online platforms met with tremendous resistance within the traditional university system, even at the universities where it sprouted, where it was sponsored, like Stanford University, which was really the birthplace of a lot of what's happened. In Stanford, 75% of the faculty didn't want to have anything to do with it. They were afraid of losing their jobs. Now we saw in a very brief period of time, universities all over the world compelled to move from the classroom online. And I don't have time, and my intention is not to argue that the whole world should go from classroom to online education as a full solution. I'm saying we had to break the mold of thinking that the way we're doing it is the only way to do it or the best way to deliver the highest quality education at the lowest cost. And there's a lot of work being done now. We discussed it at our conference at the UN yesterday and the day before, of doing one thing. If we separate the process of certification from the process of knowledge delivery, we will democratize and open up this field of higher education, which is held at ransom by a high-cost system, and enable us to disseminate knowledge to much larger, many more people, higher quality knowledge at a much lower cost. So those are my brief remarks, Mr. President, and I hope that it leads to some discussion. I intentionally focused on the positive aspects of a very serious crisis, because I think that's where we see the opportunity for the future. And we've got to move away from the existing paradigm and not trying to build back to what existed 2 years ago or even 1 year ago. It's simply, we weren't on a viable course, and to go back to that, even if we could, would not solve the problems that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary, for this ample perspective on the challenges that we are facing. Indeed, the financial aspect is very important in a crisis. and we will discuss the issue further on, as well as its impact with another guest, Dr. Emil Dinga. However, as you mentioned, we need to be aware and emphasize more the connection between universities and the labor market. Education, be it online or in classroom, should continue to provide high quality knowledge and abilities in order for these young people to be able to access better suited jobs. Now we also have with us Mrs. Shoshana Beckerman, Director and founder of the Interparliamentary Coalition for Global Ethics. Since 2017, she has been working as a strategy consultant for the Israeli Druze Association for the Culture of Peace, as Vice President of the American Association for Central Asian and Caucasian Countries, Religious in Dialogue, and Ambassador of the Spanish Association Cultura de Paz. She also has a lengthy experience in state affairs, having worked as a parliamentary advisor in legislative affairs and international relations and chief of staff in the Israeli Knesset between 2009-2015. Shoshana is an active supporter of achieving a global culture of peace, and she works tirelessly in that regard. Her contribution focused on capitalizing the pandemic as an instrument in the building of a culture of peace. Shoshana, I invite you to tell us all, how can that be done?
It's good to see you all, Your Excellency, Mr. President, honored speakers, and participants. Thank you again it was an honor to have worked with you all these years in person. Unfortunately, we are now faced only with Zoom contact. As we're facing the challenges, one of the biggest world crises with this COVID pandemic, I think it has taught us it is time to show support for each other and bring down all the barriers. Today, good health system and infrastructures are key conditions in order to better fight the pandemic. However, we see that many countries are still affected by conflicts and internal tensions, and this causes a lack of capacity to slow the spread of the virus, even though we now have therapeutics and vaccinations on the way. This explains why the UN first called on a global ceasefire on March 23rd, when the pandemic started to hit all countries. This could seem like a quest that would fall on deaf ears of guerrillas, terrorists, and belligerent governments across the globe. However, COVID also has provoked a series of discriminatory acts across the continents, with different groups being targeted. If the profile of the victims varies from one country to another, there seems to be a common pattern in the discriminatory acts that occurred during the pandemic. Most often, the targets are foreigners or people belonging to ethnic or cultural minorities. We see that this also exacerbates the problems felt by disadvantaged groups, including access to healthcare, social assistance, education, and employment. We've seen this not only in countries afflicted by conflict, cross-border or national, but also across the United States, the UK, and many European countries, as well as Africa and across the globe. The main challenge is to take this as an opportunity for peace, for dialogue and negotiations. Peace is not only a political problem defined by the absence of violence and war, it is also characterized by the liberation of fear and includes political, cultural, economic, environmental, social, and educational issues. It involves living together with our differences, whether they're language, religion, or culture, and promoting a universal respect for justice and human rights that such coexistence depends on. The UN Sustainable Development Goals has provided a roadmap for some of these issues that we're facing. Although it was devised before the pandemic, it clearly has a lot of, let's say, solutions to some of the problems we are facing now with the pandemic, which have been, I think, been brought to us in a more clear and challenging manner. Throughout the years since the founding of the United Nations in 1945, the UN organs, agencies, and programs and bodies work tirelessly to implement the goals of the United Nations as specified in the UN Charter and as expressed in many of the UN General Assembly resolutions on the culture of peace. And our work in the Interparliamentary Coalition for Global Ethics, we started in the year 2000 by noticing that all of these resolutions clearly have not been translated into national legislation. And our goal was to form coalitions between parliamentarians, civic leaders, and religious leaders to promote national legislation for mandatory education for the culture of peace. With some of the, again, we have had several very important successes, especially with the Council of Europe written declaration in support of the initiative, which was preceded by the Levant initiative, which was actually a partnership between the Interparliamentary Coalition and President Constantinescu's initiatives. Right now, we are in, let's say, a framework of forming additional coalitions. The Abraham Accords has afforded some new possibilities. We are in touch with the King Hamad Global Center for Peaceful Coexistence to form a partnership, which we hope we will extend to the Institute and to the World Academy. The goal, of course, is to promote national legislation in UN member states, to institute the UN resolutions on the culture of peace, institute legislation on issues of global ethics, including protection of the environment, including plant and animal life. One of the things which I would like to point out is that COVID, if this, the science proves, began with the abuse of animals in China, in the wet markets. Also, the issue of the new strain, which was found among minks, which also are greatly abused. So this is one of the issues of protection of the environment that we should pay attention to. We have learned throughout history that abuse of the environment and animals leads to human rights abuses. So this is one thing we need to also focus in education. The additional legislation we are promoting is protection of children, youth, and elderly, translating social media ethics into law, and implementing social justice through legislation on business ethics. One thing we know about ethics is that when society cannot discern between right and wrong, you have to translate the ethics into legislation. This is why we're working so hard to promote this in the national legislations in coalition with the civic leaders who will be charged, whether they're educators, religious leaders, or public officials. They are charged actually to implement this. One of our, as a concluding note, one of our board members, if you recall, the former speaker of the Parliament of Madagascar, Jean-Max Rakatamonji, has also presented a new and very, very important proposal to promote the appointment of a minister or secretary of peace in all UN member states. We think that this is vital in order to achieve all the goals that we are have been promoting before the pandemic. And now, as our former speaker pointed out, since the educational frameworks have been have posed a challenge, and a lot of learning is being done online. The identity of education is being changed. We think that is vital to include in the identity the framework of education, the culture of peace, as a foundation for the post-corona and COVID era. Thank you very much, and we look forward to further cooperation and to achieve our goals together.
Thank you, Shoshana, for this tour de force of all the infrastructures that we have been affected by the pandemic, and the many issues they engendered for the following years, as we all agree that the impact of the pandemic will be long term. I'm glad to see that you have anticipated in your speech the issue of sustainable development, that will also be approached further by another speaker. As you mentioned, after having identified the problems, we need to also focus on the solutions. Bearing in mind the necessity of achieving a culture of peace, a matter which is very dear to me as well as to the Institute I run in Bucharest. Our third guest and speaker is Dr. Hakan Suver, who is the president of the Marmara Foundation Group and also the founder of the Eurasian Economic Summits, which have been taking place continuously since 1998 and adopted as an international prestige association. Dr. Suver is a civil society leader who is consecrated in the world for his work on peace and intercultural dialogue. In fact, Dr. Hakan Suver receives a pontificate medal from Pope Benedict XVI due to his works on intercultural dialogue, first in Turkey and then internationally. Dr. Hakan Suver was our first contributor with a strong piece entitled "Tomorrow Will Not Be Like Today." Dr. Suver, please tell us, why are you so determined in believing in the new tomorrow? He also sent us a recording of this intervention, which will be played now.
Dear participant, first of all, I wish all the participants healthy days. Of 2020, due to the coronavirus pandemic, what we have been living from 10 months and will continue to live for a while, I greet with respect the Levant Institute and in their person, His Excellency Emil Constantinescu and his friend, who gathering us in order to share our thoughts about tomorrow. We are having a hard time. At the end of these difficult days, we will meet a world unlike today. What will the world be like after COVID-19? Will there be more competition or more cooperation? It is a very difficult task to seek answers to these questions in a period when the pandemic is continuing, when no one can tell when it will end. However, the first indications show that the pandemic unfortunately reinforces pro-existing competitive trends in international relations. Before the emergence of COVID-19, states, especially the wealthier ones, were highly selfish and less likely to take responsibility for global affairs. Global governance was under pressure. International organizations were struggling to stay relevant. Declining global cooperation went hand in hand with increasing nationalism and great power politics. Moving away from globalization had increased universalism, and to rule-based international order were struggling. COVID-19 highlighted and accelerated all these developments. The extent to which the current international system is ineffective in tackling the international committee's COVID-19 crisis and its social, political, and economic impact has clearly proven today. What is not clear is what to do about it. We have two alternatives: the increasing isolation that each state goes its own, or that states are reshaping international organization and strengthened multilateralism, where they combine their minds to find global solutions to global problems. As humanity, we need international organization with high capabilities, wide resources, and strong will, which can overcome global political and economic problems, as well as produce solutions to environmental, cultural, and health-related problems. The pandemic made this clear. It can be a good starting point to consider institutional approach that can lead all countries to cooperate in line with their own needs and possibilities. After summarizing this, I would like to talk about the Marmara Group Foundation with its activities during the pandemic. As the Marmara Group Foundation, despite the new type of coronavirus we are experiencing, we blazed a trial and successfully held the 23rd Eurasian Economic Summit in the digital environment via satellite. Despite the pandemic environment, 69,653 people watched the 23rd Eurasian Economic Summit in geography from South Africa to People's Republic of China, from Mongolia to United States, from Tunisia to Kyrgyzstan. At the 23rd Eurasian Economic Summit, which was attended by the audience from time to time and asked questions from time to time. There were visionary opinions about the future as well as daily comments. President of Sinovac Vaccine Research Center, Madam Helen Young, gave the latest information about the COVID-19 vaccine, while American, French, Russian, and Georgian researchers and Turkish and Azerbaijani member of parliaments brought up the events in Karabakh in Azerbaijan. As Marmara Group Foundation, we are a pioneer in civil society activities in Turkey. In the COVID-19 pandemic process, we conducted a study called Corona Days, whose subject is what kind of world will be tomorrow. 66 thinkers, including His Excellency Emil Constantinescu from 23 countries, participated in this study by writing an article. Again, in this pandemic period, the Grand National Assembly of Turkey realized the 100th age of honor. By doing an exceptional study on this subject, we published a book consisting of the articles of former and current chairmen of the Turkish Grand National Assembly, deputies, and thinkers, and that shed light on history. In this successful working environment, we have prepared a book to commemorate the 19th President of Turkey, His Excellency Süleyman Demirel, who has an important share in the establishment and development of the Marmara Group Foundation. In the book, we gathered the memories of the President and his political friends who knew Süleyman Demirel, including His Excellency Emil Constantinescu, President of Azerbaijan Ilham Aliyev, President of Kazakhstan Nursultan Nazarbayev, etc. Marmara Group Foundation EU Human Rights Platform successfully completed another EU project during the pandemic period. Marmara Group Foundation, which concluded the project titled Turkish Youth and Women for Democracy in the 90 months due to the pandemic, first completed its work and activities in Istanbul, Ankara, and Berlin. After the pandemic, the workshop held digitally over the webinar came to an end with hybrid events. I would like to end my speech with the words of Sir Winston Churchill. Don't waste a good crisis. Well, let's not waste this crisis either. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Suver, for your thoughts. You highlighted two main aspects that caught my attention. Will the world be one of cooperation or one of competition? And well, will the pandemic end? Both questions are difficult to answer at the moment. As states are struggling between isolationism and the need to reshape their stance within the international society, the latter is the one that should respond. Thus, the main responsibility falls now on the shoulders of international organizations to provide patterns of response to their member countries. Let me introduce you now Dr. Laszlo Borbély, Associate Professor at the Babeș-Bolyai University at Cluj-Napoca and State Counselor Coordinator of the Department for Sustainable Development of the Romanian government. Between 2010 and 2011, Mr. Borbély was president of the 19th session of the United Nations Commission for Sustainable Development. A year later, he was appointed vice president of the Governing Council of the United Nations Programme on Environment and co-president of the European Environment and Health Ministerial Board. As you can see, he is a true champion of sustainable development in all its aspects. Dr. Borbély wrote for the platform of our institute a piece on the challenges of the reconstruction on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Please tell us more what he has been done in that regard.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here again to this very select club of so many eminent speakers. So thank you very much for the Institute of Levant Culture and especially for President Constantinescu for his initiative. I believe that the humanity now, it's in one of the most challenging and unprecedented crises. Why? Of course, during the last 15, 20 years, we have some economic crisis, of course, some smaller pandemic. But now we have an economic crisis, a social crisis, crisis of course, of health, and the crisis of basic values. We are seeing fear, we are seeing suspicion, we are seeing anger, we are seeing more tension around us. And this is the most dangerous for society. To have no confidence, to have no solidarity, to have no vision, and to have no tools in your hand how to put in place. So in June, as I remember, we were confident that until the end of the year, we will come back to a normal life. So we are here, yes? Some of the countries around us, very well-developed countries, Austria, Hungary, and others, Germany, they are thinking, and some of them in October, November, September were in lockdown. They closed the country because they were, of course, obliged to close the country because of the pandemic. What we are doing now in this moment. So just also in June, I spoke about our strategies. We have to reshape our strategies. It's a new chapter in our life. Of course, this is the pandemic, and I was thinking there are good parts of pandemic or no. We have good parts. Of course, one part was that regarding greener, approach of our life, better life and greener life, because of the economic crisis, now we have in some areas more positive parameters regarding environment. But it should come a pandemic to realize that that we have to change our behaviors. It's very sad. So we have to recover us. We have to recover better and greener. What means this? About Romania. Romania now, for the coming years until 2027, we have more than double more money like in the period of 2014-2020. Why? Because we have this plan for resilience to recovery from the European Union. What we are doing with this huge amount of the money? Each country has to prepare himself because we have the Green Deal. And I was very surprised in a positive way regarding the attitude of European Union. They don't stop. We don't stop regarding Green Deal, regarding strategies for circular economy, regarding a new strategy for industry, regarding new strategy from farm to fork, regarding a new strategy on biodiversity, regarding a new taxonomy, how we are able to have answers for the private sector, for the economy. So there are very good lessons that in crisis, if you are not stopped your way of thinking, you can be successful. But how we will use this opportunity? For Romania, it's a very challenging way. We need priorities. We have now a new recovery plan, just on public debate. But on the first version, I saw that, of course, we have some projects regarding infrastructure, regarding others, and for those who has no money from European Union programs and operational programs, we just pass them to the recovery plan. It's not enough. We need leadership. We need a vision. We need 6-10 priorities for Romania, and based on Green Deal and based on a new mentality. So, in my opinion, we have Agenda 2030. We have the Paris Agreement. They are the most important document of humanity in the last, I don't know how many years. Let's use it. We have Green Deal. We have European Union like flagship and other countries also. We are very strong in regional area. Mr. President Constantinescu knows about Black Sea, and he has a very, very great experience on this. And now Romania, regarding how we implement Agenda 2030, we are a regional hub, Romania in this. Why? Because we have contact with all the coordinators in all the countries, UNICE countries, more than 40 countries. Who are the coordinators on implementing Agenda 2030? We have to convince our politicians that they have to think based on 17 SDGs, based on 169 targets. And Romania is on the way to prepare our budget for 2020. We can do like this. Okay, we have a new government. Hope that as soon as possible we will have a step 1 year or 2 years to put together these pieces, to put together our projects, our programs, but to change our basic behavior to try to have a sustainable life. Thank you very much.
Very well pointed, Dr. Barbeli. We are facing a crisis of values. And it seems that the past 8 months have deepened it instead of bringing us all together. Sadly, as you just mentioned, the pandemic had to happen to steer a change in strategy and perspective in multiple fields of activity. It is interesting and challenging to see the positive side of the pandemic, which, as you just said, has the potential to bring change for the better. We look forward to see how countries manage that and how they will operationalize the Agenda 2030 and the Paris Agreement in order to achieve development. As for us, Romania's stand is concerned, we rely on this opposition to coalition neighboring forces. I am pleased to introduce to you now Dr. Emil Dinga, professor in economics and economic philosophy, a scientific researcher at the Romanian Academy, where he leads the Nicolas Georgescu-Regan seminar on the logic and methodology of economic knowledge. Apart from his academic and research career, he worked for several years at the Romanian Banking Institute in Bucharest, where he focused on international cooperation in the banking and financial sectors. Dr. Dinga wrote for our platform a thoroughly analytical and extremely well documented piece on an anti-fragile and diversified economic world. Dr. Dinga, I believe I speak in all our names when I say that I am anxious to ask, how can that be achieved?
Thank you, Your Excellency President Emil Constantinescu. I am very glad to participate at this conference. My presentation for today is one synthesis of the document, a larger document sent to Institute. And I want to address especially some economic issues. Please allow me to share my presentation on the desktop. Thank you. So my presentation is about anti-fragile and diversified economic world. First of all, to find lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic, we need to know what is our enemy. So we need to discuss about the nature of COVID-19 shock. In my opinion, there are 4 predicates that characterize this COVID-19 shock. It is a non-economic shock. That is, it is not generated by an economic variable change. Secondly, it is non-systemic. That is a singular event. Singular events are non-predictable, logically speaking. A third predicate, this is unpredictability. So such unpredictability is without either deterministic or stochastic patterns, so help us to get future values or future replication of this shock. And the fourth predicate of this shock is it is external. So it not emerged from the economic process. First of all, lessons we should learn from this shock addresses the economic process. Economic shocks, and even non-economic ones, which are originated inside the economic system, are easier to define. because economic process is already evolutionarily adapted to its economic environment, but less adapted to the non-economic one. Robustness and resilience devices and procedures are aimed at to preponderantly fight the economic, partially predictable shocks. The adaptive adjustments are easier made against economic-only shocks. So, I think 3 lessons we must learn regarding the economic process. Redundancy against non-economic and external shocks based on 3 issues: warehouses of goods, alternative working ways, and alternative trade, for example, online. Anti-fragility is a more important lesson regarding the economic process. This means this economic system must be specialized so that to gain advantage from perturbations. And sustainability, a third lesson. So structural completeness of national economic system so that it to be able of gaining autonomy when international relationships are disturbed. That is functionally implementing all 5 economic sectors. Regarding the economic institutions, the state of the art is, in my opinion, the following. Humans' evolutionary traits are set towards survival, not hedonic well-being maximization. See, for example, behaviorism and even precautionarily social biology. Consequently, a medical or health crisis affects human behavior and aspirations much more than an economic crisis. And based on social contract, the state must provide avoiding, preventing, and treating of the life-threatening shocks. And probably 2 lessons are more important regarding the economic institutions. The need for a national public special fund to finance the medical health expenditures involved in fighting non-economic shocks. To be fed, these public special funds, from private economic activities of the state, namely state-private field. Nota bene, similarly to funds aimed at economic resilience and recovery, see the EU fund in course. And the second lesson, adjusting EU provisions, that is Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, so that the public expenditures with medical health pandemical shocks to be exempted from calculating the structural deficit within fiscal compact framework. Some lessons of Romanian national economic complex. State of the art is the following. In an increasingly competitive world, each country is alone when faces a crisis, either economic or non-economic. Consequently, Romanian national economic complex must be or must become much more autonomous in the international concert of trade and cooperation. 4 lessons regarding Romanian national economic complex. Institutional, ensuring of the structural, implicitly functional, high autonomy, sustainability, and very important, anti-fragility of national economic complex. Strategically, nationally closing of chains of the 4 crucial social activities, economic sectors, technology, trade, and financing channels. Politically, gradually and firmly passage to ordoliberalism, that is to combining the economic performance with the social justice assurance. As a lesson, I think, is addressing the globalization must become a mean, not a dividend for I don't know who, so that the national interest be pursued by harmonizing it with EU and world's as a whole purposes. What about economic order generally? State of the art is the following, in my opinion. Praxeological optimality paradigm of the current capitalism already led us to too many cul-de-sac. Consumer resource depletion, economic injustice. The care for human life, wealth, health, well-being, and personal developing are almost totally something is endowed, in fact, with sufficient resources to sustain human life, if they would be distributed equitable and based on the objectified merits. Three lessons, I think, could be captured in this field. Cutting and discouraging of the symbolic economic flows which unfold without real economic support or capital, and which so dramatically increase the risk of crisis, see financial bubbles. Fiscal supra-taxation of the investment done exclusively for the sake of excessive personal pride, leading to crowding out of those resources from to be used for real current basic needs of humankind. And re-establishing the sovereignty of national states against globalization, so accessing globalization to become a free choice according to own interests and aspirations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Dinga, for such a complex presentation on the economic situation during the pandemic, especially the situation of Romania. As you mentioned, all aspects, politics, strategy, and economy, interconnected in order to provide social relief in the event of the crisis. Also, we are members of international organizations. When dealing with financial difficulties, each state is alone in devising its recovery policy. And this is even more difficult to achieve in a greater context of globalization, which the pandemic showed to the both a blessing and the menace in the spread of the virus. Our next speaker is Stefan Brunhuber, who is a medical director and chief medical officer, Diaconi Hospital, Germany. Vice chairman of the European Institute of Health. He was been active in the managing boards of numerous medical institutions in Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and the USA, and in several commissions related to healthcare issues. Besides, he is an elected member of the European Academy of Science and Arts and the Austrian chapter of the Club of Rome, as well as trustee of the World Academy of Art of Science. Dear Stefan, you sent us a contribution for our platform in which you described the pandemic as an asymmetric shock. And you now working tirelessly in the hospital, fighting the pandemic as a first responder. Please tell us more on your view and experience of this asymmetric shock firsthand.
Dear Honorable President, dear fellows, dear friends, thank you for having me. It's crazy times. I'm in the midst of a corona crisis. We expect within the next hours and days, it's getting very ugly, also here in Germany. But I would like to shortly speak on a debate we have at WAS and at the Club of Rome on this current COVID crisis. You know, I think it's a it's a planetary momentum we're in, a momentum we've never experienced in humanity before. And we can characterize it as an asymmetric shock in the sense that it is unprecedented, it is global, it is external, and it's disruptive. And it's disruptive in a way that we can ask two questions here. The question is, should we optimize the given rules of the game, especially in finance and economics, where I'm involved in? Or do we have to change the rules of the game in the first place in order to achieve greater prosperity and greater sustainability for the future? You know, I'm a psychiatrist, and from a psychiatric perspective, I've never experienced a situation where 7.5 billion people on the planet within a couple of weeks are basically synchronized for a potential change. This has never happened in history before. And in psychology and psychiatry, we call this a global mental preparedness for change. We use that term in addictive medicine to prepare someone to change getting out of addiction, but this can be applied for our collective situation as well. This change can be done to the good or to the bad. And I would like to show you just one graph, if I may. Just one graph in order to leave you with that. During the last couple of years, all the way to the 80s, our entire economy, our entire society has been basically focusing on increasing the system, which means throughput per time. And we're running down this curve along efficiency. And all the crises we're facing, pandemics, species loss, or global warming, are basically caused by increased efficiency of our current economic system. Any increase of the efficiency of the system at the same time increases fragility or volatility. And if you look at this crisis from a systemic complex theory perspective, we have that curve, inverse U curve, where we have to see that the optimum with regard to sustainability is between efficiency and resilience. And my previous speaker already pointed out the term of anti-fragility. At the top of that curve, we're basically in an anti-fragile zone. And anti-fragility stands for the fact that we're not only resilient towards shocks, but we can learn getting out of these shocks in a more improved way. What can we learn from this crisis? What can we learn from this planetary momentum for each of us, for economics, for politics, becoming more resilient, shifting towards more the resilience part of that curve? I would like to point out 5 R's. The first one is a new form of risk assessment. We have to look at risks in a complex world from a different perspective. The special term is total cost analysis. We have to start internalizing our externalities. The second R is regionalization. We have to start to decouple parts of our globalized value chains towards more circular regional economic chains. The third R is the renaissance of regulation. We have to think about new forms of rules and regulations, how to get out of this crisis and to move on. The fourth R is reshaping behavior, meaning each of us can do something. We can start driving a bike. We can start becoming a vegan. We can start changing our mindset. And the fifth one is regenerative agriculture. So with these 5 R's, we are going to shift our entire society away from the brittle efficiency mode towards a more anti-fragile, resilient mode. And this is the lesson I'm learning as a medical doctor here at the hospital. And this is also the lesson I've been learning being involved in VOS and Club of Rome and better understanding the nonlinearity of complex systems. Thank you very much.
Dear Stefan, thank you for such a profound analysis of the shock we are all facing now. We should, as you said, change our perspective in order to be resilient or even become resilient, should we have not achieved it yet. A circular economy and regenerative agriculture and the other areas that you mentioned could be the solution to the pandemic, but we have the future to look up to and confirm or infirm. Thank you for your medical perspective and for sharing it with us. And we need to speak again and see whether you are right. Let's hope.
Emil, thank you very much for having me. I just want to make an informal final statement. You know, I'm loving your country. I've been in your country in the 80s of the last century as a professional truck driver, driving to Bucharest and back. And I hope we can see us physically in Bucharest again. Thank you very much.
We're waiting you in the future. Hope to see you in Bucharest soon. I will now turn to Fadwa El-Gwindi, who is a retired anthropologist from the University of California and a fellow of the World Academy of Art of Science. A past president of the Society for Visual Anthropology, Dr. El-Gwindi previously served as the Distinguished Professor of Anthropology and head of the Department of Social Sciences at Qatar University. She was also a professor of the University of California, Los Angeles, and taught anthropology at the University of Southern California and Georgetown University. Her expertise on the Middle East brought her to the Clinton White House, and she frequently gave lectures to the diplomats assigned to the Middle East at the Foreign Service Institute of the U.S. Department of State. Dr. El-Gwindi, it is a pleasure to have you with us. I see that you have such an impressive experience in dealing with state affairs, and yet when sending your contribution to our platform, you chose a sensitive matter. You argued in favor of rediscovering our humanness. How can we do that in the midst of the pandemic?
Thank you, Mr. President, for inviting me to this panel and for this discussion that is much needed at this time. I think we tend to deal with the pandemic as part of other problems, and we have to really focus on the pandemic and how all the other problems are feeding into it. I'd like to raise 3 points regarding, of course, the pandemic. One of them is what you alluded to, our humanness, that for at least 100,000 years, we were evolving to become human, and the key aspect of making us human was the capacity that was developed to cognize, which is to imagine a reality, to create but also the generative capacity to organize ourselves as social groups. This is no minor matter. It took millions of years to reach that point, and organizing humans into social groups is a very problem that we can do. So you can imagine what happens when a pandemic hits, and because the character of the pandemic is based on the transmission of that virus from person to person, and these humans are told, drop that aspect that is the basic and fundamental element in your humanness, which is connecting with other people, taking care of our elderly, being with our elderly as they die, being with our children Christmas. And all this is hard hit by the pandemic. And this is the heart of the humanness. The other aspect, the ability to cognize, is also important because that gives us the avenue by which we are going to be imaginative and how to deal with that. And we are already Zooming conferences, chatting throughout the conference, and so on. It was very touching to watch Italians go to the balconies when they got locked down because of the pandemic, which hit Italy very badly at the beginning. And that's the way to express their humanness. They went to a balcony and started singing opera, which is their strength, and other people from other areas, from other balconies joined in. This kind of experience happened in many parts. That is, the humans are reaching out to say, this is our fundamental basis of how we are human, and it's being taken from us. And that might, of course, be related to the anger, the impatience, the revolt against staying indoors and being locked down. The other point I want to talk about is social inequality. That is, the pandemic didn't cause all the problems we have. The pandemic accelerated, magnified, and unmasked many things that already existed because we were doing things wrong. If you look at the United States now, the United States, a very powerful, prosperous, large country that is really a continent in and of itself, is experiencing very high rates of infection and very high rates of death. And now the phenomenon is coming back and it's hitting the United States again. But it concerns me as an anthropologist, like, who are the people who are being hit the most? And we find that they are the marginalized communities, all the homeless that America has been neglecting for generations. Programs are made like, let's create a shelter for the homeless, let's vote on the shelter for the homeless. How could that be? How could we reach such prosperity and allow such a large number of human beings to be in the streets without any services, just dying? And many of them are really just mentally challenged. So they are not accepted in institutions in the United States because they don't have insurance and they don't have money to pay to get into a hospital. So they are thrown in the streets. And now we are facing a pandemic, and they are hit, the most hit, the Latin American communities that are marginalized, the African American communities that are marginalized. The pandemic didn't cause these. The pandemic showed us that when you have these weak spots in society and a pandemic comes, these are the spots that will be highlighted. And still, I think our leadership around the world are not talking about these social inequalities. They are talking about what the pandemic causes, as opposed to what the pandemic has uncovered and unmasked. I was struck by the fact that when this crisis hit the world, that it hit the prosperous, what I call the North, the prosperous nations who are well developed, who are industrialized, and who have all the services available to them. But they're also the ones who got hit first, and then it started spreading. Ironically, the stereotypical expectation was, like, we look at Africa, they will need help. They are the ones who have no infrastructure for public health. Africa, except for South Africa, Africa in general is doing much better than Europe and the United States in terms of the numbers of infections according to official records, and the death rates. So, in other words, we should be interested in that. We should be interested in the problems and the patterns to see why is it so. Is it that these prosperous countries have also internal inequalities that have now emerged as the epicenters of that virus, which spread to everybody else? They are the rich ones who travel all over in business class. Now they have become the elite who Zoom into conferences, and we are yet to see how that creative mind is going to deal with that new Zoom culture. We talk about the problems in education, and we call it online learning. We have not shown yet that there is learning. It is too soon. The research that is now ongoing shows that there is an attempt to teaching online, but that learning is suffering dramatically. The children who are kept from going to school and are staying at home are suffering. And many of them now are going to psychiatrists and need mental health because of that change, not able to cope with the transition, nor are they able to deal with the homes that were family and nurturing and mothers who take care of them, to also sit there and go online and learn from, let's say, it is such an unnatural situation. We really need to go into some detail about the problems that are facing us. We may not be going into better education. We may be going into teaching without learning. And I think all of that is important in terms of sustainability. We have to really look at sustainability in terms of how we fared in this pandemic. And we are privileged to use the internet, but how many people in the world have no access to the internet? And is there an organization that's providing free access to the internet to all these people around the world who are cut out from this discussion? They are simply locked down in their homes with all the problems that I mentioned and have no internet or cannot deal with the internet. And we need to make it a human right to access the internet if we are going to move in that direction. We want to ensure that the youth of the world have access to the internet, because the youth are moving into that new world that we are creating. But if they cannot afford the internet, or if their country cannot have the infrastructure for regular internet, they will not be able to deal with it. I know individuals who are not really in impoverished countries. They are in the United States of America, in Philadelphia, who are not able to get food because they cannot get delivery because delivery is now online and they don't know how to use a computer to get delivery. They are senior people who never use the computer and are seeking other people to help them deliver food to them. So there are minute problems that we want to focus on. And I am optimistic despite bringing up these problems, because exactly of what I said at the beginning, that we are a cognizing species, and we're the only cognizing species who can imagine and create and will imagine new solutions. Thank you.
Dear Dr. El-Guindi, I would like to thank you for mentioning creativity and the power it has. Apart from the technological creativity that we saw at work in hospitals during the past months, I believe that the individual creativity was the safest, cheapest, and most at hand solution that ordinary people embraced in order to survive these terrible months. Be it by playing music in the balconies, as did the Italians, or the innocent drawing that children put in their windows of a rainbow and the joying message, all will be well. It will take a long time until the disease will be eradicated. Until then, we need to rely on creativity to solve all the other issues that the pandemic brought to light, including the social inequality you mentioned could be given creative solutions. We just need to be creative. Our next speaker is Ash Pachauri. Dr. Pachauri is the founder of the Protect Our Planet movement, POP movement, as well as an associate fellow of the World Academy of Art of Science. Having worked with McKinsey and Company before pursuing a career in the social development arena, Dr. Pachauri's experience in the fields of public health and management emerges from a range of initiatives, including those of PATH, a Catalyst for Global Health, United Nations Development Program, International Planned Parenthood Federation, and Center for Disease Control and Prevention Program Intervention in the United States. Dr. Pachauri sent us a strong piece on the COVID-19 pandemic's warning to the world. Can you tell us more about the warning you identified and how should we all deal with it?
Thank you so much. Warm greetings to all, and thank you once again for this invaluable opportunity to join you at this imperative dialogue. Your Excellency, Dr. Branda, Mr. Jacobs, and distinguished leaders, I'm delighted to be here with you. In a few minutes, what I'd like to share is that a world post-COVID-19, which draws on lessons of the pandemic, would only be possible if we heed COVID-19's warning to the world. Some of my previous speakers have already articulated some of these lessons and messages, but I'd like to put them in a context, especially from the point of view of protecting our planet. Among many lessons, I shall share three in particular with you today. One, research suggests that outbreaks of infectious diseases such as Ebola, SARS, MERS, bird flu, and now COVID-19 are on the rise. The US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimates that 3/4 of new or emerging diseases that infect humans originate in animals. Infectious outbreaks like the novel coronavirus threaten to become more common as human populations destroy habitats, forcing wildlife into closer proximity to humans. As humans continue to encroach on animal habitat and destroy fragile ecosystems, they come into ever greater contact with animals, increasing the likelihood of future pandemics, such as the one we are living through now. 2, it is amply apparent that in the current world of uncertainty, the one thing that is certain is that the health of the planet and those that inhabit it are inextricably linked. 2 years ago, the United Nations declared plastic pollution as a global crisis, and that the year 2020 was meant to mark an ultimate shift away from plastic as countries and cities introduce new bans. Yet, the coronavirus outbreak and increasing numbers of infections have sidetracked the narrative on the plastic pandemic. And yes, it is a pandemic, and is more so now on account of plastic. PPE has already found its way to the depths of the ocean and seabeds. It is predicted that we now risk having more masks than jellyfish in the sea. Large volumes of mishandled and biohazardous waste generated during COVID-19's outbreak have jeopardized the environment and, believe it or not, human health. This is an oxymoron, as PPE was intended to keep us safe. But it is not the first time the world has witnessed such myopia. Finding a response to one issue at the cost of another. We have seen this with solar panels and the unsafe disposal of solar panels, which continue to cause serious public health risks through the release of carcinogenic and toxic materials in countries like Bangladesh and others. 3, we heard last Friday, which was on December 11, that carbon dioxide emissions in 2020 fell by 7%, which is the biggest drop ever. The decrease in carbon emissions this year may be unprecedented, but we are far from a sustained decrease in global emissions. Carbon emissions must fall by 7.6% annually, which is larger than the unprecedented drop seen this year for a decade, which is 10 consecutive years, to reach the 1.5 degrees centigrade mark. Also, because of previous pandemic trends, experts have warned that emissions are likely to rebound after the pandemic, which is typically what we've seen. To draw on lessons from COVID, we would need to ensure this drop is not just a temporary respite, but a sustained one. The way to reduce emissions and mitigate climate change in our world post-COVID-19 is to speed up our transition to a low carbon and green energy technology-based future, which demands a significant departure from business as usual. It will take redefining models of development post-COVID-19, which will be based on new production and consumption norms, as well as engaging all countries and communities alike. And I want to underscore the previous speaker brought up, as is Dr. Stefan, that I think what we have seen thus far in our so-called inclusive approaches are that most often they are exclusive, and the most vulnerable and marginalized communities that are in fact at the forefront of the multiple pandemics that COVID-19 has unraveled, which we heard just a few minutes ago. And therefore, it is an absolute must that we engage the many populations excluded, including by the digital divide, and overcome the mental health challenges, which Dr. Stefan highlighted as well, as a result of social isolation, which with all our social opportunities available via Zoom and other technology must be overcome. Furthermore, engaging the 1.8 billion youth of the world, as well as leveraging experience and wisdom and ancient knowledge, and truly being intergenerational in our approaches, which move us from dialogue to action are critical. What I'm going to say finally is that we need to think and act collectively in a world post-COVID-19 and prepare for what comes next. Fundamental to this is the recognition that the current disruptions due to the pandemic are likely pale in comparison to the upheavals in store. If governments and all stakeholders alike do not act aggressively based on facts and science to adopt models of development to improve the lives of all species, and I underscore all species, while protecting our planet. Our ability to draw on lessons of the pandemic would only be as good as our willingness to heed COVID-19's warning to the world. In the words of the great Albert Einstein, I quote, "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." Thank you.
Thank you. Once again, we have another tour de force through multiple domains, going from the imminence of some diseases still manifesting to the protection of endangered species and the rise in plastic consume. Thank you, Dr. Pachauri, for highlighting another set of problems that the pandemic made acute. Your voice was one of warning not to fall prey to the thought, but by attempting to solve an issue, the rest will soon follow. We need to be inclusive in our work, as you urged us, and others matter from all its corners. And yes, collective action is a must, because the problems you mentioned are not affecting only some of the countries and worldwide actors, but will eventually affect us all. Now, last but not least, we have with us dear friend Winston, an old friend, Winston Nagan, who is a member of the Board of Trustees of the World Academy of Art of Science, but especially former chairman of VAS. Winston Nagan is professor of law and director of the Institute for Human Rights, Peace and Development of the University of Florida, Levin College of Law. He is also international editorial advisor to the Journal of Law and Politics. He served as chairman of Amnesty International USA in 1999 to 91, and as a member of the board 1986-1992. He also served as president of Policy Science Center, Yale Law School, in, between 1986 and 1991, and on numerous groups of international experts on issues related to human rights, biodiversity, indigenous rights, and traditional knowledge. Winston sent for the Institute platform a piece on sovereign absolutism and the danger it poses to the currently turbulent times of the pandemic. Winston, tell us, please, how exactly does this type of absolutism you speak about impact the world we know?
There's several angles to my paper, and I'm just going to give some of it, okay? The first and most important issue is the one of sovereign absolutism. And of course, the COVID-19 doesn't confine itself to the boundaries of sovereign states. So the more absolutist you want to be, the more you'd be in denial of the reality of a threat that carries over to all other states. This means that we have to think through the scope of sovereign absolutism. Is it okay? Can they hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. We have to think through the scope of sovereign absolutism and its constitutional foundations, and we have to think through the scope of globalization and its constitutional foundations. And there seems to be a line which separates out globalization from constitutionalism. And that means that we have the UN Constitution, which is narrowly construed, and then we have globalization, which is virtual global anarchy. So we have to obviously have some organizational principles by which we can make sense of globalization, constrained to the basic foundations of global constitutionalism. So this gap between globalization and the UN Constitution needs to be further solidified. In other words, we have to make the UN Charter real by having it a real force of restraint and guidance for the future of globalization. And in that way, we can provide greater guidance to the states and state absolutism. Now, I realize this is a dry legal issue, but people tend to assume legal issues in such a way that they forget how important they are for the rational organization of human beings in terms of rational purposes and rational objectives. And with the current crisis, it's fairly obvious that if you have no real laws managing how this is to be contained and improved, we will essentially have a system where the leadership itself is problematic. And I hate to say it, but in the situation that I'm in today, I live in Florida and I live in the United States, and the two greatest failures of leadership today in the context of this pandemic has come from the state of Florida and from the United States. To my knowledge, I think yesterday was the first time in many, many months that the cabinet of the Trump administration actually met, but they met in closed session and they wouldn't tell us about what they were meeting. And even though we've reached the stage of over 300,000 deaths, the president hasn't said one word of empathy about this tragic situation. Now, he's modeled, sadly, in my state, the state that I live in today, because 3 days ago, the governor sent a contingent of police to the chief researcher on this matter. They broke into a house, guns blazing, and removed all her computers. The governor's position was that by telling the scientific truth, she was actually giving out information that was politically disadvantageous to him. So computer was removed. She was threatened. She thought her children might have been shot in this process. The governor has still not apologized, but what we've learned since this overt, brutal police attack on her and her scientific work is that he's also suppressed most of the scientific work in the state so that the state and the newspapers won't know what the extent of the danger is to the state which this virus poses, you see. Now, it's very good, I think, to have a rational scientific approach to a crisis like this if you have a complete failure of leadership. And the only way that I know to constrain leadership is they have to be constrained by law. if there's no law that guides or constrains leadership, they can do anything or they can do nothing. Either way, the public loses, you see. In the case of the President of the United States, the disgrace has gone even worse. He was told months and months ago that the virus was an extremely deadly virus and would have devastating consequences for the people of the United States. He decided to suppress all of that information because, as he said publicly, he did not want to create a panic. So the president has sat on this and still has not quite admitted that this coronavirus is a deep, deep threat to the United States. Instead, he's been silent on the matter. Okay. Now, he's gone much further, sadly. He's ridiculed the advice of his own medical experts about the wearing a mask. All the medical evidence shows that the simple act of wearing a mask will prevent you distributing the virus to others and will prevent you from receiving it from others. Yet, this has become a major political thing. When his supporters go to meetings and they see people with masks, they attack them. Right? Then there's the question of social distancing. He's ridiculed social distancing as an absolutely stupid matter. Why should we want to socially distance ourselves? Okay. Now, the great success of his approach has been that 2 days ago, his Secretary of State organized a major Christmas party for almost 1,000 people. No masks, no protections, no social distancing, no health measures, okay? 70 people showed up. The other 800 and some odd didn't show up, okay? Now, apparently they're canceling all the other parties because no one wants to show up to an event that has the possibility of spreading the risk even further. Now, this is the kind of leadership that's coming from the leader of one of the most important societies in the world. He also had to withdraw from the World Health Organization. But we've not been given any explicit reason as to why it was so important to get rid of, to remove the United States and its long-standing collaborative relationship with the World Health Organization. Why at this point in time we should withdraw from the World Health Organization is a mystery. So essentially then what I'm trying to say is that when we start out with sovereign absolutism and you got guys like Trump and the governor who's a junior in this with no restraints on what they can do, suppressing science. The governor has done his job to suppress science within the state, and the president has done his job to reduce the influence of science on national policy, in particular with regard to how we approach the appropriate medical interventions to constrain and minimize the effects of the coronavirus. So we have several problems. One is we have the problem of the constitutions of the states, which are not adequately organized to restrain unlimited leadership. We have the constitutions of states, which are somewhat independent of the UN Charter itself. So the UN Charter itself, over time, has weakened the UN system itself. And in my opinion, these issues are so interdependent and so very much interdetermine the human future that the UN Charter and hopefully a global charter for globalization is not a desirable, it is a necessity. Globally, we will not survive without the ability to communicate, to collaborate, to share knowledge, to share wisdom, and to share solutions to the common problems that face humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Winston, for highlighting the need to focus on leadership in the present crisis. International institutions need to adapt their strategy, starting with the United Nations, and the rest should emulate its example. Just like our lives can be changed by the pandemic, so has the existence of these institutions been changing. And afterward, states need to acknowledge the need to change their strategy. You mentioned the difficulties that the United States is experiencing lately. I will not go further into the debate, but this is a situation in which statesmen must move from the allied state ideals and work directly with and for the people. Thank you all for such wonderful presentations and the accuracy of the research you performed in the writing, the contributions for our platform, which will soon be featured in a printed volume. The time we established for this debate is running out, and we will probably leave the Q&A session for another time. Before moving to the conclusions, I would like to salute all the other participants from all over the world. I see Fotini Pomoni from Kapodistrian University, from Athena, Greece, Rodica Toader from the University of Udine, Italy, and Mila Popovic, Eric Hödl, Zbigniew, Broniac, so many other friends present today. Thank you all for your participation.
Thank you, Emil, for organizing this conference, if I may. It's a great event to see my friends from world academic and new friends, and also colleagues from Romanian universities. And last 2 days in UN, United Nations also organized conference. Let's capitalize it and, take it for actions. This is what we need. And as an educator, we need to start from tomorrow to bring these ideas, these new ideas, and thinking out of boxes to our classes and encourage creativity, entrepreneurship, and leadership, what we needed. Thank you very much once again. It was a great event. Happy holiday season.
Thank you, Zbigniew, Moniac, for your message. And we look forward to having you together on the platform and in the book. Anyone else wishing to say something about the debate or address our speakers? Thank you, Marianne. You have the floor.
Hi, this is Mariana Bosizan calling from Germany, but I was born and raised in Romania, so I'm thrilled to see you all, and I would love to thank you for a wonderful conference. I'm thrilled about the contributions, the depth of thought, and I because this is my life, I'm a serial entrepreneur and investor. I just want to bring your attention also to the 90% of the jobs that are being created through small and medium enterprises, and they need to be supported. And this is what Gary Jacobs, Stefan Brunhuber, Mila Popovic, Rodolfo Fiorini, and many, many, many others have done over the past 2-3 years in supporting me particularly in coming up with some wonderful solutions on how to get the capital that is currently being available to those in the hands of those entrepreneurs, so that they are being supported in knowing how to implement the UN SDGs within planetary boundaries in high ethics and morals. And so this is actually, I'd like to bring your attention to this. I'd love to send you a copy if you send me your address to the Institute. This is the first report of the Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Club of Rome. So it's been made and accepted, the report, to both organizations on how to help young entrepreneurs and create the jobs that we need post-COVID. So please let me know how I can be part of this and help you all and help ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina, from bringing the issue of entrepreneurs to our attention. Indeed, this has been a difficult time for them. Thank you for offering to send us the book. Juana will send you the address of the Institute, and since you volunteered this, may I ask you to send also contribution to the platform of these issues, if you agree. Now,
thank you, thank you, and thank you, Jack.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Do you hear me, Chairman?
Marcel.
No?
Marcel van
Yes, my name is Marcel van der Voorde. I have been listening with great attention, although that I'm sitting in Brussels at the European Commission with the Brexit meeting, together with colleagues of the United Kingdom. In any case, I think what I would like just to mention is that I personally was very much involved in the research for a vaccine during the last 8 months. And I never have seen such an international cooperation from China to the US, to Europe, to Russia. Unbelievable. And I think that have brought a lot of results as a vaccine, which normally you get after 2 or 3 years or longer, that we really get it in a few months. Thanks particularly to the international cooperation, and these people will certainly do it also after the period of the COVID. I also would like to make a second point, is that the technology brings a lot of advantages. It has also been mentioned during this conference in respect to the digitalization. Also for the classrooms, and that people can follow the courses from home. But the human value is still dominating. It is not that the digitalization of the advanced technology, although that are like research and technology, will not solve all the problems. The human value is so important, and this will also be in the future. If you look to the students, they were happy to follow the courses, but the computer is not replacing the professor. The third point I would like to make is that economics is very important. Finance and everything what you could think about has helped the unemployment. They also have tried to keep the economy going. But on the other side, it also has killed many, many people. If you look to the United States, and some have given these examples, but also in other countries, one could ask in how far that the economics is dangerous in the life of the society. As if you really see about yesterday evening, I still heard about these so many people of the third generation. That means older people have been killed and that they were put on a second and a third priority in some countries, in some hospitals. And this is, I think, a kind of a regrettable point. So in conclusion, there have been the so-called corona has given a certain amount of positive effects, also negative effects. The point is that how will be the life after the so-called COVID period? It's very difficult to expect. I think, number one, that the people living today, certainly in the Western world, in a very luxurious way, in a very kind of egoistic way, that afterwards it will probably be more human. And this is a great advantage. For the rest, one had to put it in a balance, and it would be very difficult for you, Chairman, and for your assistant to find the equilibrium. What is more negative or positive after the COVID than before? It is a very difficult analysis. I had, from a few of my people at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, at Heidelberg, have analyzed that a little bit in a kind of a study. And it's very difficult if you look about the table, which you see what is positive from very 25 points, what is positive and what is negative. Between the both, you don't find much, but it would be very useful to get your study at the end. But be careful that you very well analyze how the so-called COVID, what the COVID has done during the difficult period in which we have been living, and what it has brought to the society as a whole in future. Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, may I intervene?
Sure.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jonathan Granock. I'm a fellow in the World Academy and the president of the Global Security Institute. I just wanted to say that all of the proposals and the way we're addressing the COVID crisis really fall under the paradigm of human security. That this is the fundamental function of the state, to provide security to its citizens. And COVID has made very clear, since it doesn't carry a passport, that the state as a central focus rather than the humans in states is insufficient. This is demonstrated to the world, to every citizen, that all the military expenditures cannot protect us from this. Similarly, the challenge of the climate cannot be solved at a national level, nor do the huge expenditures for militaries provide any benefit to protecting the climate. And yet, if you conceive of the budget as the skeleton of the state, the major, most influential states are spending enormous amounts of treasure on the militaries, modernizing nuclear arsenals at extraordinary cost in the trillions of dollars. So if we don't address changing the very paradigm of how security is identified, I think that we'll be on the margins, very much like the SDGs, a powerful, visionary, appropriate, practical agenda for a sustainable future, but inadequately funded, unknown to the general public, and not galvanizing the political support required. So I think we need to have a change of how we define security from militarism and nationalism to people. Now, I think going into the future, there are several models of what a more cooperative, global, focused, political, institutional order would look like. And let me give an example of some of the issues that I'm thinking about that I personally don't have a proposed solution, and thus requires a much more robust global conversation of the best minds on the planet. In the not too distant future, at a relatively low cost, kits will be available for hospitals everywhere to take a swab of the saliva of a newborn infant and essentially DNA code it or decode it. And then a purely utilitarian argument for delivering better health services would argue that that information should be gathered in a central data bank. And obviously that would provide economies of scale and great scientific benefits. It would also provide the people who control that information with enormous political power. And some models of governance on the planet are authoritarian, and one could don't recognize the importance of privacy, don't recognize the importance of the sanctity of the individual, don't recognize the property rights. There are many rights that they simply don't recognize. And on the other hand, the tools that we have to constrain the abuses of authority, law and morality, checks and balances in institutions, have proven to be much more fragile than many of us had expected. Certainly the United States, even at this moment, the fragility of checks and balances has demonstrated themselves. I thank God for the rule of law, and our courts have stood up. But if a few judges had spun the issue a little bit differently, the checks and balances on the abuse of power in this country would have collapsed. So there has to be some, and the international legal order, the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, etc., are far too weak presently. So on the one hand, there'll be an enormous and very effective argument for greater utilitarian gathering value and gathering information, and I don't see the commensurate institutional arguments to constrain the required centralization of global power. We require global governance. There's no other way to protect the oceans. There's no other way to protect the climate. There's no other way to protect against pandemic diseases. There's no other way to, unless we change the definition of security from militarism and nationalism, I think it'll be continually difficult to get rid of weapons of mass destruction. And similarly, we must strengthen the international legal institutions to constrain the increasingly need to centralize global power. And I personally don't see a simple answer to this, but I see a need for the best minds and the best minds on our planet to address this need. Last but not least, I just want to remind everybody that when Jonas Salk was asked, when he discovered the Salk vaccine, when he was asked Edward R. Murrow, the great journalist, asked him, who owns the patent? And he said very, very rapidly, the people own the planet. It's like the sunlight. We haven't seen the robust argument, at least in the major states, that the vaccine should be from the beginning and explicitly treated as a global public good. Not to diminish the property value of those who helped create it. There's lots of ways to meet their economic needs. But conceptually, the idea that we could move toward a vaccine apartheid world is not attractive. We need our political institutions, in addition to the scientists who were cooperating as human beings, our political institutions to step up. Thank you. And thank you for this wonderful conference. And thank you, Gary, for pushing us all together.
This is a nice ending point to our debate. I thank Marcel van der Voorde for this intervention. I am particularly great to have you, Marcel, with us. Given your extensive experience in European institutions, and also given the fact that you are in Brussels, the hotspot on the debate, and how to share the vaccine sooner and to the whole of Europe. I agree with you on the online education. Computers really do not replace professors. Computers provide knowledge and skills, but they do not provide empathy and human values that interhuman experience provide. And we need to stick to his humanity, to make it the poster child in our fight against the coronavirus. Jonathan, thank you for the highlighting that this is all about human security. And as you said, the military has no role now. We are far from engaging in a debate on the need to change state strategy on military expenditure. But we need to enhance the rest of the measures that we can take in order to become resilient to any type of crisis, be it corona or another. As mentioned before, we need to focus on what us as human can do, and then unite to propose a solution to the institutions. We are talking about resilience, which is a military concept. We started this debate talking about the lessons of the pandemic. Before talking about the lesson learned, the military addresses first the lessons identified. This is what we have been doing in the past 2 hours. We identified the lessons, and I look forward to have them learned in the near future, for our benefit, for benefit of the dear ones, and to humanity in general. Thank you all for your participation and for making this event a starting point for the next year's phase of our project on the pandemic and its outcome. All your work will be gathered in a volume, in a book which Juana Brenda and I will be coordinating, and which we hope to see published in the early months of 2021. Also, I look forward to seeing you again next year, as 2021 is drawing close, and discuss not the problem we identified as we did today, but in fact the lesson we learned from the pandemic. I wish you all happy holidays, happy new year, and to stay safe and healthy. Goodbye.